Good evening, and welcome to the midweek service of Calvary Baptist Church. Glad to have you with us this evening. On Wednesday nights, over the last couple of months, we've been going through the book of Numbers, and we finally finished that, although technically I didn't do the last chapter, but there was so much repetition of the last chapter from things before that I don't feel too bad about skipping that, and we're going to jump into a new study, and not only a new study, but a whole New Testament. We're going to go from the Old Testament into the New Testament and back towards the end of the New Testament to the book of James. So over the next few weeks or so, I'd like to have us do a study of the book of James on Wednesday night. And tonight I'd like to just introduce the book to kind of get a survey, some introductory thoughts, some strategic looking at what the book is and what we might look to get out of it by examining the general nature of the book. And some questions about the book that we probably should have answers for, because there are some certain aspects of the book that are debated, and we ought to be prepared to perhaps answer some questions about the book of James. So the first is the name of the book, James, which I'm not exactly sure how this happens, because I'm not sure James would recognize his name. Jacobus is his name, which in the Old Testament we would have said was Jacob. But for some reason, the Greek name Jacobus, through time, I think probably the French messed us up, and somehow Jacob turned into James. So anyway, I'm not sure he would recognize his name as we say it, but Jacob has turned to James somehow through the quirkiness of the way languages work. So anyway, James is the name of the book, and first thing is just trying to understand who this author was. Who is James? Well, if you would have asked that in the ancient world, they would have almost certainly laughed at you. Who is James? Because everybody was named James. There's a lot of James in the ancient world. Jacob, Jacob becomes Israel. It's the founding. It's the father Israel, and so there's a lot of Jacobs or James. So, and interestingly enough, there's only 4 of them named in the New Testament, which actually maybe is a little surprising, because there are probably a lot of James, like I was saying. Interestingly enough, of the 4 James, 3 of them are listed in one verse. So before we get to actually the book of James, if you could look at Acts chapter 1 and verse number 13, we see that there are 3 James listed all in one verse. Acts chapter 1 in verse number 13. And when they had entered, they went up into the upper room where they were staying, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. So there are 3 James there in that verse. The last of the list there is the least significant. The only reason that James is listed there is because the author, that Luke wants us to know that there were 2 Judases. One, Judas Iscariot, of course, of infamy, and the other Judas is the son of James, and that's the only thing we know about him, is that he was the father of a Judas. So that's the least significant of the names. James, the son of Alphaeus, does not play a major role. In fact, the only time you hear of James, the son of Alphaeus, is in the lists of disciples. We never hear him say anything. We never hear of him doing anything. He's just one of those disciples that gets named. So, not a significant figure in the New Testament. The third one, however, on our list, James, this other James, who is the first one listed in this verse, is arguably the most important of the James in the Gospels. Not arguably, unarguably the most important. Because this James is not only one of the 12, he's one of the 3. He's one of the 3 most important disciples who are in this inner circle, who get certain privileges. They get to see Jesus raise a dead girl. They get to go up on the Mount of Transfiguration. They are singled out among them. So this James is a very important James. Unfortunately for James, and decidedly against him being the author of the book of James, is that he's martyred by Herod. It's recorded in Acts chapter 12 that James is killed because of Herod's wrath against the Christians. So he doesn't live long enough to be the author of the book of James. So who is this fourth James? Well, the fourth James immediately comes to the forefront as the strongest possibility of the author, although we don't really know for totally certain that this is the James, because it could be a James, we just don't know. It seems unlikely whoever wrote the book of James assumes that he doesn't need to identify himself very much. And so you would think that would be somebody that a lot of Christians would know. So that kind of puts this fourth person as the best choice and the only choice that we could really make a good guess at. And this is James, a brother of Jesus. Jesus has a number of brothers. For example, Mark chapter 6, verse 3 has a question from people who are wondering about this Jesus, who he is. And they say, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they were offended him. So there is one of the brothers of Jesus whose name is James, who doesn't play a prominent role in the Gospels, but later he does. And so we can find some things out about this brother of Jesus. Some of them, a few things directly, and then some things that we can put together by implication about him. Who was James, the brother of Jesus? Well, first of all, he's a skeptic during the life of Jesus. So look at John, the Gospel of John, chapter 7. And verse number 5. "For even his brothers did not believe in him." So Jesus had a lot of skeptics, and among the skeptics are his brothers. And we don't hear about sisters, but maybe sisters as well, are skeptics about him. I'm not sure whether this verse directly refers to his brothers, but it could. Look at Mark chapter 3. If it does, it says something both troubling and interesting about James, the brother of Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, people are concerned about the kind of things Jesus is saying and claiming for himself. Mark 3, verse 21 says, "But when his own people heard about this," what does it mean, his own people? It could be family, or maybe family plus others, the people that knew him. But when his own people heard about this, they went out to lay hold of him, for they said, "He is out of his mind." So perhaps James, the brother of Jesus, thinks his brother is out of his mind, that he's crazy. So James is a skeptic during the life of Jesus. However, after the resurrection, he comes to faith. We don't hear the narrative about it, but the 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 7 tells us that James is one of the ones that Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, and so he becomes a follower. Now, the most that we know about this person, James, the brother of Jesus, he becomes the prominent leader of the Jerusalem church. And so in the book of Acts, chapters 12 and chapter 15, James is featured as perhaps the key leader of the church of Jerusalem. So, for example, in Acts chapter 12 and verse number 17, but motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. So Peter escapes from prison, And he identifies, go tell the church, and notice James is the only name listed, which is kind of the indication that he must be the main leader. He must be the one that is representative of the whole. Look at Acts chapter 15 and verse number 13. In this chapter, the Apostle Paul is coming back from his first missionary journey, and he's reporting about how the Gentiles came to faith. And the Jews largely had rejected the gospel message on the first missionary journey, and many of the Gentiles, or at least a lot of the Christians who believed, were Gentiles. And Paul comes back with enthusiasm with Barnabas. They report to the church. And yet there's some questions about what's going on, because this is the first time Gentiles are fellowshipping on a spiritual equality with Jews. And the church is asked to debate, what do we think about this? This is a new thing for Jews to think about. And so Paul presents the case that they ought to be received just on the basis of faith in Jesus, with no other criteria. In other words, not circumcision, not observance of feasts and festivals and those kind of things. That only on faith are they to be received. And so as they talk, the church begins to talk, and James is one of the key figures. So Acts chapter 15, verse 13, and after they became silent, James answered and said, "Men and brethren, listen to me." And he goes on to give a kind of a concluding talk to this whole debate. So it looks like James, although perhaps the leader of a democracy, not democracy in terms of public politics, but in terms of the church making decisions, the church is kind of wrestling with things, and James is the leader who sums up what he believes the conclusion is. And so he agrees with Paul that they ought to receive the Gentiles with a couple of qualifications that we don't need to worry about now, but are a couple of concerns that the Jews have about the Gentiles respecting some things about true religion. In Acts 21, verse 18, James appears there, but more importantly, I think we can look at the book of Galatians. James is featured in Paul's letter to the Galatians. In chapter 1, Paul is rather hotly contesting the gospel against its enemies and against heresies, or against compromising the gospel. And James kind of figures in some of these talks. For example, Galatians 1, verse 19, Paul's talking about his trip to Jerusalem. And he's kind of telling his story about how he came to the gospel, not through men, but by God himself through personal revelation. He says, verse 19, "But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother." So he's talking about this leader of the church of Jerusalem. He saw him, but none of the other apostles. Chapter 2 and verse 9, Galatians 2:9, "And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised." So Paul is focusing on the Gentiles, but James and these others are focused on Jews. So the primary ministry of James is to the Jewish Christians, where Paul is opening the doors to new realms to the Gentiles. So what we know about this James is that he's a prominent leader, if not the prominent leader in the Church of Jerusalem. He ministers to the Jews. He is well respected. He is stalwart in faith at this point. And so we know that he's prominent enough to refer to himself without needing a lot of explanation. So when we read the book of James and the author says James, well, he assumes that we might know he doesn't need a lot of introduction. So this is the best option we have in terms of evidence. And as opposed to James, one of the three inner disciples, James lives long enough. This James, the brother of Jesus, lives long enough to actually have written the book, where the other James is killed relatively early in the church life. A couple other things about James, the brother of the Lord, that this is kind of slight and not in any way certain, but just kind of an interesting thing about this, is that if you read James, the brother of Jesus' speech in Acts chapter 15, and you read it carefully, and then you read the book of James, there's a couple of things that if you are studied in Greek, they kind of pop out at you a little bit. And again, these are not major points, but just minor things. And they're kind of things that maybe certain people have speech patterns that are idiosyncratic, that they're unique to them. And they're just little things that you wouldn't really think anything about, but it's the only person you know that speaks this way. And there's a couple things in Acts 15, in James' speech, and in the book of James, a couple of expressions that are only used in this way. And they kind of, not the New Testament isn't a huge volume of material, but it kind of stands out that there's a couple unique expressions. For example, when he says greeting, he uses a Greek word that none of the other words in the New Testament use. None of the other greetings use this particular. It's a unique word. And it's used in Acts 15, and it's used again in James chapter 1, verse 1. So I don't know, maybe it's nothing, but it just seems like it's kind of, it's interesting that these two James use the same unique way of saying hello, howdy. You know, some people just have a unique way of saying hello to you, and that's kind of what this is. It's just a little different way of saying hello, and maybe it doesn't mean anything, but it's just a little piece of evidence that it could be the same. Sometimes you just pick up something somebody says and he's like, hey, I know somebody else that says that. And also he has this unusual expression that he uses the verb call in a passive voice, which is very unusual. You typically don't put call, because call is an active thing. You call actively, but he uses the passive voice and he says call on a name. And this is the only time that this is used in the New Testament, that expression of call in the passive with this. Again, it's just a little sliver of a verbal style that is unique to these two places. And then the other one is that he says in his message in Acts 15, listen to me, my brothers. And he says the same thing in the book of James, listen to me, my brothers. And he's the only one that uses that expression. So anyway, just a couple of verbal cues that maybe it's the same person speaking in Acts 15 as in the author of the book of James. Some other things make it extremely plausible that James, the brother of Jesus, is also the author of the book of James. And that is the circumstances that we know about them are extremely similar. So we know that James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church, is ministering to Jewish Christians. The book of James is written to Jewish Christians and focuses upon them and speaks to them in Jewish kinds of ways. We'll talk about that more a little later as we go through here. We'll talk about some more of that evidence, but there's a Jewishness about this that resonates with who the brother of Jesus is. He's ministering to Jews that have become Christians. A second thing we know about James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, is that the people, the Christians, had scattered to the winds, to the corners of the earth under persecution. That Acts chapter 8 tells us, when it's introducing Paul, breathing threats like a fiery dragon against the church, the Christians spread throughout the world. And then again, later in the book of Acts, we hear that there was a persecution, and those who were scattered traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. This is Acts 11:19. And Antioch, preaching the word to no one but Jews only. So the people that were in Jerusalem, these Jews scattered and they ministered to Jews. So they are a dispersion of Jews. Well, the book of James begins, to the tribes dispersed. So, in other words, it's the same kind of situation. The author of James is writing to Jews who are spread throughout, and they're not in any one place. They are spread to all different places, just like we find that the church in Jerusalem would have been scattered, and their pastor is logically, it makes sense that he's interested in what happened to them. Your people that were in your church and the people that are fellowshipping all of a sudden are scattered. Wouldn't you as a pastor be like, what happened to you? Where are you? So it fits the situation to think that James, the book of James, is a follow-up to that dispersion. We also know something about the dispersion, both from the New Testament itself and outside the New Testament, is that when the Jews were dispersed like this, the Christian Jews were dispersed, that they were fairly poor, and that the wealthy landowners, the people who had money, bought up almost all of the land. And they bought up the land, and when they did that, they could pay the workers as little as they wanted because the workers had no choice but to work for them. There was no other place for them to work. And so you can imagine Christians dispersed, probably poor, maybe lost their jobs or maybe couldn't get jobs, and now the rich had bought up the land, and that fits the scenario of the book of James to a T. That, when you read James, you see that there's rich landowners who are persecuting, who are oppressing the poor. And that fits the situation that James, the brother of Jesus, would have been facing with his church people who are now needy because of this situation. Another thing about that's similar to just what we could think to be true, to use kind of our Christian imagination, is that James is, the brother of Jesus, is trained in Judaism. He's trained as a Jew. And the book of James is one of the most Jewish books in the New Testament. In fact, while the book of Hebrews is written to Jews, Hebrews has a very rich Christian theology. I'm not saying James, the book of James, isn't Christian, but there's not really a developed theology in the book of James. There's not a developed Christian theology. You don't hear a lot about the doctrine of Christ. You don't hear about the doctrine of the Spirit. You don't hear about the more sophisticated questions that Paul is wrestling with in Colossians and Ephesians. James is a very Jewish theology book. And so in that sense, it's primitive Christian theology. It's kind of like the first lessons that a Jewish Christian might be learning, and it's really tied to these Jewish practices. And so it's easy to imagine a church leader like James, one of the first pastors, ministering to Jews, keeping the heritage of the way that what they knew from the Old Testament, and a little bit challenged by what Paul's saying. Maybe they don't fully grasp like Paul does, but they have a primitive Christian theology that's not as deep or as high as some of Paul's writings or even John's writings. It's very much primitive Jewish. So you can imagine somebody like Pastor James teaching in this way. Now, one of the questions I mentioned, there's some questions about the book of James that we need to at least know about and address. And that is, the book of James was questioned about whether it should be in the Bible. The books of the New Testament were scattered around the Mediterranean world, and they were read in churches, and they began to be bundled together. We know from records that Paul's letters were kind of bundled together and sewn together, and some other letters, the Gospels, were distributed. But there's questions about what happens with the book of James. And so it's one of the last, if not the last, of the books that church history tells us was finally, everybody agreed it should be in the Bible. So there's questions about what might be called the canonicity. Canon means the standard of books, the list of teachings that guides Christianity. And James was kind of the last to to be formally recognized in the canon of the New Testament, the list of New Testament books. And it kind of seems to be slow in coming in how it happened. So, for example, there is a famous collection of New Testament books called the Muratorian Canon that was put together in the 2nd century. And the book of James isn't in that book. So in that listing, it had not yet been formally recognized by that particular set of people that it was in the New Testament. However, Eusebius, who is a famous church historian, he lives in the 400s, 400 years AD, he says that James should be in the Bible, but calls it disputed. That he lists it as one of the books, but also says that not everybody agreed that it was one of the New Testament books. We know from other church sources, early church sources, that the churches in Syria, or the Syrian church, the churches in the area of Syria, Damascus and around that area, doubted all of the general epistles. The general epistles are the ones that are not written to a particular church. They're written, like James, to scattered believers. And the Syrian churches, they doubted the general epistles. And the Syrian church had a lot of influence upon what we know of early church history. So that's another kind of evidence of the doubting. However, it was endorsed by the Latin Christian scholar Jerome, and he put it in his Latin Bible, and he doesn't have any doubt about it. However, famously, or maybe infamously, Martin Luther had a troubled relationship with the book of James. In fact, Martin Luther called the book of James a right strawy epistle, or an epistle of straw, a letter of straw. Luther struggled with it. Now, kind of what's interesting about it is that he had that skeptical view. In fact, one time, I don't know if he was in a bad mood and James had gotten on his nerves, but one time he wrote that James mangles the scriptures and thereby opposes Paul in all scripture. So something about James must have really bugged him that day. But interestingly enough, he quotes it a lot. So he didn't reject it, but he just kind of struggled with it. He's like, he thought he knew the New Testament, and James was one of those books that was like, should this be in the New Testament? This doesn't tell me what I think I already know. I kind of like that about the Bible, is that every now and then you think you've got the Bible down, but actually you have a Bible within the Bible that you've pushed out some other things. And James was one of those things that, it's one of those, like, I don't know if you ever have gotten ready for a trip and you have too many clothes to fit in your suitcase, and so you're packing it all in, and you close the top of the suitcase and this sock, juts out the side. And you're like, so you push the sock in and you close it, and another sock jutted out the other side. And you push that back in, and you're like, I can't get these socks in the suitcase. And that's kind of, James is kind of like that. You're trying to get all your theology together, and you think you close it, and there's the book of James sticking out, and it hasn't quite got in the. And so Luther kind of feels like that. He senses that. However, he did say this. He said, I cannot include him, that is James, among the chief books, though I would not prevent anyone from including or extolling him as he pleases, for there are otherwise many good sayings in him. In other words, Luther doesn't know what to think about the book of James. He doesn't want to put it, he wants it to be a second-class citizen in the New Testament. He says, I can't say it shouldn't be there because there's a lot of good stuff in there, but he couldn't quite reconcile it. So there's Martin Luther's doubts about the book of James, that even he isn't saying it shouldn't be there, he just doesn't think it should be the first book you read. Well, how do we explain this? A couple of things I think we know about the book of James that we can make some sense of what's going on here. First of all, the early church didn't reject James, they just didn't read it very much. It was more neglected than rejected. There was no people saying it shouldn't be, like Luther saying maybe it shouldn't be, but other people they didn't seem to know about it, or they just don't mention it. They weren't making a case that it shouldn't be in the Bible. It was more neglected. Second, we know that the early church really favored the apostles. They loved Paul, they loved Peter, they loved John, and James is written by someone who's not an apostle. And so a couple other books are like that, not written by apostles. The Gospel of Mark, for example, is not written by an apostle. So they really thought the apostles were so close to Jesus and had this authoritative word that they favored. And James doesn't quite fit that category. A third thing is what I mentioned before, is the early church is fighting with Jews. They're being kicked out of the synagogues. They're being forbidden from trade in Jewish markets. They are being persecuted by Jews. And so the early church is focusing on distinctive Christian theology. They want to defend the Christian faith. And James is a more general book than that. James is more like, kind of basic life lessons. James is more about just kind of practical living. He's not arguing for unique, distinctive Christian theology. They were fighting battles that called them to other books, and James comes from a bit of a different perspective. A fourth thing that we could say about the book of James is that a lot of the letters of the New Testament are written to churches that became the main churches in the ancient world. James is written to dispersed Christians. There's no single major church. And so while it's being circulated, it doesn't have the reputation of being Ephesians, the church at Ephesus, or Colossae, or Thessalonica, these churches that Paul founded that became, at least in the early days, these key churches are, of course, Romans. These were major places where the book of James is circulating in a much less obvious place of importance. So perhaps that's one of the reasons it took longer for it to be recognized. And about Martin Luther is great for highlighting the doctrine of justification by faith. But justification by faith is not the only teaching in the Bible about salvation. Justification is the entrance into the Christian life. It's the foundational point, but it's not the complete picture of salvation. And so Luther struggled with that. He couldn't understand justification, and when he did, that's all and so James seems to be something that is an additional. So in this sense, I don't think Martin Luther was as mature in his theology as he really needed to be commenting about James' significance. So there's reasons I think that we could say just because something has a different emphasis doesn't mean it shouldn't be in the Bible. So Luther, I think, was a little misguided on that. Let me just summarize some features of the book of James, and then let me try to apply it, and then we'll go to our prayer. Just some features. There's just some general things, having read the book and overviewed the book, some things that you find in it. First is that, this isn't something you find in the book. This is something that I see when you read it. That is everyday Christians like the book of James. Theologians, it's not their favorite book. I'm not saying they dislike it, but it's not the huge theology. It's practical living, and it's kind of where Christians tend to be. And so in that sense, the book of James it tends to be pretty popular. It's one of the more, when people say, oh, let's have a Bible study, what should we study? And the average Christian says, James, because they kind of know it has some things that speak to them. So it's popular among average Christians. Some things about it is that it's written to a general audience, and yet a particular situation. That is, dispersed Jews who are struggling with economic distress because rich people have had a monopoly on the economic system and are getting every last drop out of the workers that they can possibly have. And so it's that particular situation of the poor being oppressed by the rich. It has a very specific situation in that sense. You can kind of see the conflict. You see the anger of the poor against the rich and conflict among each other. But there's no specific names. There's no individual names. So it's kind of that interesting combination of a specific situation without, like Paul, greeting all these people and has a personal relationship. So in some respects, the book is general, but to a specific situation. The book is very practical. It has good theology in it, and I think very interesting theology in it, but when you read the book of James, it reads very practically. it's a one exhortation after another. And so it kind of is very, you feel like it's hitting you. It's like James is telling, I want you to do this and I want you to do that. Whereas Paul's letters, it's like 3 chapters of big theology and then some practice. This is basically all practical points. It has a very Judaic, a Jewish, and a Hebrew style and a very Hebrew theme to it. It's very similar to books that Jews were reading outside of the Bible. There was a man named Philo who was kind of a theologian, teacher, and James sounds a lot like Philo. They have that kind of general Jewish approach. Or if you can imagine a Jewish rabbi sitting down teaching his congregation about practical living. The Jews were kind of practical, deeds-oriented kind of people. And James is like that. A very interesting thing about the book of James is that among all the books of the New Testament, James seems to know the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels better than anybody else. And he doesn't always quote it exactly, although there's one time that he nearly quotes Jesus exactly. But you always feel like he's right on the edge of Jesus' teachings. He's echoing things that Jesus taught. He's taking things Jesus taught and he's applying them. So there's a very Jesus-centered, Jesus teaching-centered. And so while the Christology of James is not that evident, like the deity of Jesus and in that mixture of natures, you don't hear as much about that, but you do hear the words of Jesus kind of behind James's sayings. Another thing about the book of James is that it's concise. The sentences are short. You don't get any of Paul's 28-word sentences. You don't get Romans 6 through 8 with this theology that you're like, oh, where was I? This is great, but I can't quite handle this. That really deep and broad. James is very much more concise. You kind of can always, he's only thinking in terms of 5 or 6 verses at a time. And then he's on to the next thing, and you're like, okay, I got that. I can go to the next point. So it's concise and perhaps in some respects easier to understand on the verse by verse level. He loves metaphors. He's the master of the metaphor in the New Testament. For example, he says things like billowing sea, withered flower, face in a mirror, a bit in a horse's mouth, the rudder of a ship, a destructive forest fire, a metal that's corroded, clothes that are moth-eaten, springs of pure water. James just has these colorful metaphors that kind of come to life. The criticism, these are people that read Paul or read some of the other books of the New Testament, and they read James, and it's hard to find what his overall structure is. If you want to persecute a student, tell him to outline the book of James. And the outline is basically verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, verse 4. It's kind of hard to outline because he's just jumping from subject to subject. And while there is some general themes that are pretty obvious, it's hard to see what the exact structure. But I think if you ever heard rabbis teaching or that kind of teaching, it's kind of like this. Or if you read the book of Proverbs. Now, James doesn't use a lot of Proverbs, but his structure is kind of like Proverbs. I don't know if you've ever read like a chapter in Proverbs. You're like, why does this proverb follow this one, and why is that one there? It's kind of more, these are Proverbs I like. And James reads a little bit like that, a series of wise sayings. So there is an emphasis on wisdom. Wisdom plays a prominent role. It may not be the only theme, or may not even be the overarching theme, but it's certainly one of the themes of the book of James is wisdom. And understanding wisdom, especially from the Jewish perspective, is how to live wisely. It's how to live smart. So you could pass philosophy class and be an utter failure in your family. Proverbs would call you a fool if you were like that. Or you could be an economic genius in terms of understanding the big economic issues of the day. But if you personally go bankrupt, What kind of economist are you? So James is that practical wisdom, that down to life, people getting along together, people avoiding sin and falling into corruption. So James is has that kind of wisdom in it. So maybe James is a Jewish sermon of exhortation. If we kind of wonder what it is, maybe it's this pastor writing to his flock that's now scattered, and he's concerned about some things he knows about their lives. So he's perhaps preaching a sermon of exhortation, not highfalutin theology for the most part, but kind of hitting people where they're at. Maybe that's why the average Christian tends to resonate with the book of James. So why study James? A couple of thoughts why. First of all, Christianity has to work. Too many Christians, too much Christianity delves in unlived truths, platitudes that don't change their life. James is going to just rips that down. James is not interested about what you know if it doesn't change your life. He wants to see Christians transformed, practically speaking. And so that's what we can expect to get from the book of James, that Christianity ought to be the power of God that's actually changing your speech, that's actually controlling your temper, that's actually causing your relationships to be healthy, that is enabling you to not live in discouragement when times get tough. And so it's life change Christianity. Yes, there's theology there, but James isn't interested in just your theology. He wants to know what kind of person you are. Second, the book is going to challenge you to be wise in your practice, to not be foolish, to not claim to know something and then end up, like I mentioned, the economist that goes bankrupt, or the psychologist whose family hates him. One of these situations of you have knowledge but doesn't work in your life. So James is going to challenge you to be wise in what really counts of how you live. So he's going to urge you to pray for wisdom, and you're going to know whether you get it because you act wisely in your life. Third, it's going to help you face adversity. The people he's writing to are under pressure. They're under financial distress. They are tempted. Well, they're more than tempted. They're already slandering the rich. They are in danger of murdering the rich because of their anger at them. So there's dangers of not handling adversity well. James is going to urge you to handle adversity, disappointment well. Fourth, it's going to urge you to get control of your temper. It's going to urge you to form a Christ-like temperament, to be a person of grace, a person of good wit and charm, good-natured, and it's not going to let you say, oh, well, I'm German or I'm Italian or whatever it is that your excuse might be for having an ill-formed temperament. So James wants Christians to have good temper. Fifth, it's going to call you to love people more than you love things, which sounds a lot like the teaching of Jesus, but to value faith, of course, and people more than possessions, which people didn't really have anyway, but their relationships were strained because they put too much concern in things that were passing. And then finally, like the author, it's going to challenge, who is a brother of Jesus? Jesus was once approached and his family was outside the door, and the people he was talking to said, "Behold, your mother and your brothers." And Jesus' response was, "Who is my mother and my brother and my sister?" Mark chapter 3, verse 35. He says, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and my sister and my mother." So James, the author of this book, doesn't call himself the brother of Jesus. He calls himself the bondservant of Jesus Christ. He says, what I want you to know about me is not that Jesus was my natural half-brother. That I could go to hell with. What I want you to know is I'm concerned about obeying him as my Lord. I want you to know that he's sovereign over the actions of my life. So those are the kind of things I think you can expect to learn, to be challenged by as we open the book of James in the coming weeks. So that's a overview. I wouldn't say brief, but an overview of James, some thoughts about its place in the Bible, and its significance, and why you might find it a compelling book to open and study and learn to practice. I'll invite you at this time to join us on our Zoom meeting for taking some prayer requests and going to prayer. And so glad you joined us this evening. See you in a few minutes. If you could turn over to that platform, we'll take some requests then. So long for now.